Hello, yes. In addition to being a research associate in the computer science department, I also run a creative technology company, and therefore, if forced to identify myself, I describe myself as a creative technologist. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the work that we do, the research that I've done over the last couple of years, and I'm going to try and condense that all into around about 10 to 12 minutes, so bear with me as we crack on. Okay. Insofar as there is a standard model for creativity, what creativity is, it's this. It's the conjunction of disparate objects, of disparate ideas, things which aren't related to one another, to create some new form of thinking. It's the kind of violent harnessing or yoking together of things that weren't previously connected. It's, in a sense, it's the naming of the words in between words. That's where ideas come from. They're necessarily built on other things. It's a combinatorial action. So when we're thinking about innovation, when we're thinking about combinations of things and creating new things, I think we tend to have a kind of strange and slightly unhealthy relationship with the future. We have a sort of paranoid attitude towards the super future that seems to be coming ever closer, creating lots of change and disruption in people's lives. But it's clearly the case that a great deal of what we refer to as the future and things that we think are exciting, are coming down fast, have already been invented. They've already been created, they're already out there, they've been written out, they're in research labs, research papers, but they just haven't yet reached the kind of scale where they've touched millions of different lives. So this is useful to us because when we're trying to create new ideas, we can look upon the past as an enormous library of potentially unexploited ideas, things that we can then recombine. And by that, I don't just mean the immediate past, I also mean the very deep past. I'll go on to explain what I mean. So this is a graph by a chap called Bill Buxton from Microsoft Research, and this is, you'll be familiar with the long tail, this is the long nose, and you'll see here at the bottom, invention is something that happens in a quite small scale way, and this could be quite a long way back. Buxton talks about the example of the computer mouse, which was invented by a chap called Douglas Engelbart in the mid-60s. If you think about the internet, a lot of the sort of fundamental ideas around the internet, including hypertext, were invented in the 70s. And so it takes quite a long time for the nose to reach real traction. It takes quite a long time for invention or just raw creativity, this combinatorial exercise, to move forward to create social change. And so that's the movement really from creativity to innovation there over time. So again, we can look perhaps to natural systems and go, well, how do these ideas come about? This is an idea by the biologist Stephen Jay Gould about how evolution proceeds. And again, it doesn't proceed in a linear manner, but it proceeds in fits and starts. You can see at the bottom here, in the first chunk, you can see that evolution just mumbles along, ticking along. And it's only when evolutionary pressure comes along, it's only when change and the environment starts to get hostile and dangerous that we see massive change within species. We see massive diversity. We see this big spike there. And then we go back to something a little more sedate. And this is probably true also of culture. The French critic Roland Barthes distinguishes between two modes of culture, the cyclic, where things tend to mumble along, and the amplic, where everything seems to go absolutely crazy and we're surrounded by all kinds of apparent novelty. Now, I don't want to belabor the combination between technology and biology too much, because technology is clearly a social phenomenon rather than strictly just a biological one. So, where do we get our ideas from? Where do we, and the work that I do, where are we inspired from? Well, I think, as I say, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of wonderful things that were created in the past that haven't really been exploited properly. I get very excited by obsolete technology. I'm more engaged by a 1950s remote control than I am by something brand new kind of programming language, for example. And equally, we can look at biology, we can look at natural systems as a form of technology, as a sort of primal kind of tech, which is battle-hardened by evolution. And lastly, because we are creating things for people to use, people to play with, we need to take those out to a wider audience. Those need to be things that people like and want to use. So the last part of innovation is that your invention must be social. And so we are informed by art movements, for example, like Fluxus of the 1960s, who created lots of exciting little games, rules for play, rules in which different people could engage with one another in slightly unusual or interesting ways. So what we're going to do is try and glue all of these disparate ideas together and show you the results. So this, as I'm sure you all know, is the main memory unit from a 1955 UNIVAC computer. And it's a splendid and glorious device. The way that information is stored in this is in mercury. It actually pushes little waves of mercury down the device, and each of those waves triggers an optoelectronic sensor, and you can store bits in there. It's an early analog computer, and it's a wonderful idea. I mean, this truly embodies the idea that engineering can be poetry. Thinking about the idea of data being stored in liquid metal is important, because it should remind us that all of the digital toys that we have, all of these things that we think of as ghost-like and intangible, are at some level based on something real, something physical that's going on inside a device, and that there's not really ghosts at work. So at the core of all sorts of computing exercises is this idea, the idea that you can store, transfer information from one format to another, and that the storing and the reading of the information, the way that information is encoded and potentially decoded, is potentially exciting, and we can maybe do something with that. Okay, so let's shift a gear now. This is Jakob Johann von Uckel, a biologist active at the beginning of the last century, and he came up with an idea that I personally find very exciting, and it's called the Umwelt. And another reason why German is an excellent language is because, just like the combinatorial examples I gave you earlier, it allows you to glue different words together. And the Umwelt is the sense world of animals. And Uckel gives the example of a tick standing on a blade of grass, and the tick gradually becoming aware that a cow is walking slowly past. It detects the smell of the cow. It knows it needs to get ready to leap on it so it can have its lunch. So information is being passed to the tick there via the medium of a chemical signal. So if you put all of these things together, you get to this point. You get to the point where you're allowed to ask stupid questions and maybe make something meaningful from them. And this is the stupid question of the day. Is a butterfly a barcode? So let's have a look at some butterflies. Here they are, rather splendid. You can see that all of them have a small but measurable amount of information, I think, encoded in the patterns, in the markings on their bodies. If we look at those, we see, great, bilateral symmetry. That's sort of 100% redundancy in information terms. So those butterflies have markings which are specifically designed to communicate to other butterflies or to things in their environment, including predators. So information is being passed in a visual medium. So this is Erytharchus rubecula, the European robin, and every morning around about 6 o'clock he and his chums wake me up with their lovely mellifluous song. So of course it's a small step, given the ideas that I've been discussing earlier, to suggest, well, maybe there's information in birdsong, maybe there's data there, and maybe we can do something useful with that idea. So just as he's broadcasting information using the medium of sound, so am I broadcasting a small but measurable amount of bits to you in the audience. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether that's useful information or not. Okay, so what we've done with this idea is try to create what we think is a new invention called Chirp, and that is a way in which you can encode small amounts of data using sound. So what we're going to now do is try a small technical demonstration, and it being a tech demo, it's likely to go wrong, but let's just give it a try anyway, and listen out now. Fantastic. So what we did with that was we encoded a small bit of data, a link, in fact, to this picture, a picture of Delia Derbyshire from the Radiophonics Workshop, 1950s audio pioneers, and we moved that over the air using sound. And we think that's an interesting example of putting together some of the things I've spoken about, which is to say technology formerly viewed as obsolete and a kind of biological aesthetic, or at least a way of encoding data that's informed by natural systems. So one of the happier parts of my life is my time I spent looking at birdsong, trying to analyze it, trying to understand how information is encoded, how much information could be re-encoded in birdsong, and how the natural world is in a continuous and warfare with, for example, the built world at the moment. I had a little epiphany some months ago when we were working on Chirp, I was out walking around chirping with 2 devices, trying to make them work in a noisy world. And at the same time, as you may or may not know, the built environment is altering animal life. Birds are now changing their sleeping patterns. They are singing later in the evening or earlier in the morning. Some species of birds are singing fully 1 octave higher because the sonic environment, the built environment that we've created, is destroying their natural patterns. So that's an example of evolutionary pressure changing the natural world. So now that we've got this idea that devices can talk to one another using sound, it becomes a logical extension thereof to think, well, maybe devices could have different tones, different timbres, just different textures or different rhythms by which they could exchange information, by which they could talk to one another. Maybe we could do something a bit more interesting and go a bit deeper into the modelling of real vocal tracks to give devices a way to speak to one another. So, what have we done here? Well, in a more general sense, I'd like you to think about encoding information, encoding data, for example, in sound as something a bit different to what we've been used to in the past. These are almost not technology anymore. These are the loudspeakers, as I say, from a Nokia 6110, and we almost don't think about loudspeakers as being any form of technology. There's so many of them around. There's almost certainly more speakers on planet Earth in laptops and in phones and in radios and in PA systems than there are human beings by some considerable margin. So it's an interesting idea that we could reuse, we could repurpose those networks of communication for something new. Because again, the future doesn't depend upon us just building new things and throwing new things into the environment. Anyone who's picked up a newspaper in the last 20 years will realize that we're rapidly running out of things to build things with. And therefore, it behoves us to start repurposing the stuff that we have already in interesting new ways. So, thinking about sound in a kind of very functional way, perhaps we could be now using sound as a spoon, as a way of moving a little tiny bit of data from one place to another, shifting information from, say, a laptop to a phone or a PA system to some other receiving device. Perhaps we could, in fact, think about money abstractly, as the makers of Bitcoin have done. Think, well, what is money apart from a string of numbers? Perhaps we could encode that string of numbers in new and interesting ways. Perhaps sound could be one of them. Perhaps you could actually do transactions, you could pay for things with a sound, with a song. Perhaps sound is more like a key. You know, we're used to thinking about sound in terms of music, and we're used to thinking about music in terms of emotional affect and the way it makes us feel, the things it makes us do. But perhaps sound could be now more usefully used as a physical effect to get us into places, to open up new digital services, to do all kinds of transaction. So the thing that gets us very excited, the thing that really gets us up in the morning and gets us back to work on these kinds of ideas is this. The idea that we can actually give voices to things that previously weren't able to communicate. And those voices can be human audible to an extent, they might be human legible, but this is our grand vision, which is to say, let's teach the machines to sing. Thank you.